So today's lectures, we're going to be talking about how to destroy Bitcoin, right? So we'll go into a little bit detail about like the game theory side of things and Bitcoin, and talk about like known attacks basically. Like a minor note is that these are all proof of work attacks, meaning that any of these examples that we state here in this lecture today apply to any proof of work blockchain. So it's not just Bitcoin. We're trying to stray away from the idea of Bitcoin, but we use Bitcoin in our examples because it's the first one that we talked about, and it's like the fundamental one to understand, right? So that's why we use Bitcoin in our examples. So a quick lecture overview. First, we'll dive into mining pool strategies. Then we'll get into forking and double spending, and then we'll cover censorship, and then Noah here is going to talk about selfish mining and defenses. Cool. Okay, let's get started. So pool strategies. So this is a basic review of all the different mining pool payout schemes that we learned in the mining lecture that Noah and Jason gave. So we have a paper share model and a proportional mining pool, right? In this paper share model, you get paid out at some constant rate for like for each share that you submit, right? And miners get paid, at a constant rate. There's no variance. In a proportional model, it's a little bit different. So the payouts depend on how quickly you find a block. And why this is important is that there's this neat little trick that people can like exploit in order to maximize the profits that they earn. So when you have these two payout schemes. So remember the fact that in a proportional payout scheme, in a proportional pool, you get more money the sooner your pool finds a valid block, because each share is worth more relatively compared to as more shares are added in, basically. So the more shares that are added or submitted to a proportional mining pool, the less each share is, and the lower your payout, basically. So we use this idea of pool hopping, where you can jump or hop into another mining pool depending on which one is more profitable. So the question that that presents itself is, why would you continue mining in a proportional mining pool when each share is worth less and less? So the idea or the answer is that you actually don't, right? So when it becomes less profitable to continue mining in a proportional pool, you jump straight into a paper share pool where the payout is more constant. It's more constant, as you can see in this reward graph. It's more constant and it's less variable. So you're guaranteed some sort of payout. And as time goes on in a proportional pool, your shares are worth less and less. So the idea is you first start mining in a proportional pool, where if you find the block in that early time period, you get paid out a lot. But once it becomes less profitable, you switch into a paper share pool and earn constant profit. Does that make any sense? So because of this idea that miners are able to maximize their own individual
Sorry, who decides on the admission of the new member to the pool? I mean, this sounds like free riding, right? If you're not successful in being the quickest one in the proportional pool, you just jump in another pool where
Yes.
it's convenient. So who decides when you're joining?
So actually, I guess when you're joining a mining pool, the pool manager will actually approve you as a miner or not. I'll talk about why this isn't feasible in practice. So because miners are able to maximize their own profits and at the expense of other mining pools, proportional pools are not feasible in practice because of this idea. Like honest miners get cheated out of their profit by being loyal to this mining pool or their preferred mining pool, and that's not good, right? So because of this, one second, let me switch tabs. Yeah, honest miners who stay loyal are cheated out of money, and so in real life, actually, there's more complicated payout schemes for Bitcoin, at least. It's not just limited to paper share. There's actually like more specific ways that pools pay out their miners. But we covered these two main categories just to give you an idea of what a mining pool payout structures look like. And so even without proportional mining pools, the idea of pool hopping is still a problem. It's still an open problem that still remains to be solved. It's hard to design incentives for people to stay loyal to. Yeah. We also have another idea that we come up or another exploit that people can utilize to earn more profit than they normally would, right? So suppose you are a miner and you want to make more money by buying more like mining equipment. You want to buy more ASICs. The question is, once you buy these ASICs, what do you do with it, right? The normal assumption or the normal way that you would go about this is just put it directly into your mining pool that you already have and continue mining away as you normally would, right? So I'm here to tell you that there's actually a better option, right? It's the idea of cannibalizing pools. You take your newly acquired hash power and you distribute it amongst the other remaining pools, mining pools, and you eat up their rewards without trying to contribute anything of value. So what does that look like? I'll give you an example of to make things more tangible. So let's suppose you have like a hefty 30% of the hash power in the network, and for like simplicity's sake, we assume that each block reward is like 1 Bitcoin. So if we look at our expected value or expected mining reward, we have 30% of the hash rate, meaning that we expect 30% of the total mining reward, which is around 0.3 Bitcoin, right? So let's say you have extra money, you want to buy more mining equipment, so you buy up enough equipment to account for another 1% of the current network hash rate, right? So if we add this 1% hash rate to our existing hash rate, so we put this 1% into our existing 30%, our existing hash rate turns out to be 30 point, or our new hash rate is 30.69, and our expected reward will be around 0.3069 Bitcoin, right? So our revenue that we gain, or extra revenue that we gain, is like 0.0069 Bitcoin for this 1% of hash power, right? So that's our naive strategy where we take our newly acquired mining power and we just directly put it where it should go, right? So this is the pool cannibalizing strategy where so instead of taking your 1% and distributing it in your own 30% mining pool, you distribute it amongst these remaining 70% of the network, right? So instead of we still have 30% of our own hash power, so we earn 0.3 Bitcoin still. But if we look at the breakdown of what it would look like in other mining pools, right? What we're essentially doing is we're taking our 1% and we're eating up the rewards from the remaining 70% of the network, right? What we're actually doing is that we eat up the rewards, but we try to contribute nothing of value. What I mean by that is whenever we come across a valid block header or a valid block, we withhold it. We don't give that out. So the mining pool that we're trying to, like, I guess, cannibalize, we're actually we're withholding the valid block, so we're requiring them to do extra work. So we're not contributing anything of value, so we don't provide them any effective hash rate. So they stay constant at their existing hash rate, so this 1% that we give to them, it doesn't benefit them at all. So, so what that looks like is that we still get the rewards from participating in these mining pools, but we don't do anything with that, our hash power. So we still get this 1 out of 71 parts of the expected value that these mining pools will get, which is 0.7 Bitcoin, and we actually get 0.0098 Bitcoin. And what that looks like when we compare them to, it's actually more profitable to cannibalize the pools than to actually mine honestly, because if you try to mine honestly, you earn 0.0069, which is less than what you would do when you're cheating, right? So this idea, this strategy presents itself to like a really big problem where we can, I guess, model this as like a game, right? An iterative game. So we have 2 players, pool A and pool B, and in each, I guess, state of the game or each stage, they have the option or the choice to either attack or not attack. And this kind of represents the prisoner's dilemma, where we have, I guess, two prisoners sitting in a room, or independently, and they have the option to either confess or not confess, right? So if we look here, we see that, I guess, if Pool A chooses to attack Pool B, they earn more money and Pool B loses money, right? But then what prevents Pool B from attacking on their end and trying to make Pool A lose revenue in in consequence, right? So we can see that like the dominant strategy in this like pool war kind of game is to like both attack each other, right? Because you'll earn more money by attacking, but then this also like raises the question of like if attacking becomes the norm, like what happens, right? So we can see like if we take a look at like the Nash equilibrium graph on like the top right hand corner, like this Nash equilibrium is like the set of strategies that is like, I guess, that benefits both parties, I guess, or like it's their best strategy to go with no matter what, right? But we see that like if we get into like this I guess this norm of always attacking the pools, we get this environment where like no one makes more profit than they would do like normally. What I mean by that is like this ecosystem is just driven on attacking and attacking, and no one's contributing any value to the network because they're trying to withhold blocks and cannibalizing other pools, right? So this becomes like this tragedy of the commons where like pools are attacking each other and like no one's really benefiting from this scenario. So we're assuming that like I guess in the general scheme of things that most miners are going to be, I guess, honest and will try to maintain the network and we'll try to keep like the network up by staying honest and mining like normally. Any questions? Yeah.
With the proportional payout, like how does the pool know, how much computing power each person's contributing, or like how is that proportion divided up?
So the question is, in a proportional pool, how is like the computing like proportion like determined, right? So it's determined by shares. So it's determined by shares, and what I mean by that is they pay out this in the proportional scheme. You pay out once this valid block has been found, and you look at the number of tries or the number of shares that it took to find this valid block, and for the number of blocks in the number of like blocks it took to find this valid one, or the number of shares it took to find this valid one, you would count for how much of this proportion or what proportion did you contribute to this like computation, right? And that's how you get paid out in a proportional scheme. Does that answer?
Yes. So then in the attack you're talking about where you attack another pool, when you have like zero proportion if you are contributing hash values.
So in this case, we're not specifically talking about any. We're not specifically talking about a paper share or proportional pool. We're saying that. If we participate in a pool and we try to reap the rewards, our 1% that we contribute to the network isn't effective. Meaning that what we're doing is that we're withholding valid blocks so that it takes more work for this this mining pool to find a valid block. We're not generalizing it to a specific like payout structure. We're assuming like expected values.
Oh, so you still submit the shares, but you just wouldn't submit like a valid block.
Yeah, so you get paid out still because let's say this was a paper share model where if you submit shares, you still get paid out like a constant amount. But we're saying that on average, our expected value that this remaining 70% of the network would obtain as a mining reward is 0.7 Bitcoin, right? And in that expected value, we get the reward from participating in the mining pool, but in our own like scenario on our end, we know that we're not contributing any value, but to the pool manager, they see that we're submitting blocks or shares to the block, and so they'll reward us for doing work. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Did you have a question?
I think I didn't quite understand why the miner who joins the fee per shares pool could take a free ride on the pool. I mean, he provides his capacity, his hashing power to the pool, and that hashing power is used to try and find the right block.
Yes.
So how does he take a free ride? He actually gives his hashing power, so it can be used for finding the block. And I don't see this as an attack. So I think I'm missing something.
So are you thinking about the first part I was talking about, like the differences between the paper share and a proportional mining pool?
Yes.
Okay. So the question is, how does a paper share model, like, how does someone, I guess, benefit off of using the like paper share model? So the idea is that right when a valid block is found, everything resets. As in, people are trying to resolve this new mining puzzle, and right after this valid block is found in a proportional mining pool, if you find a block early on, you get paid out a lot. But then, as more shares accumulate in a proportional mining pool, the payout scheme gets get diminished, basically, right? But in a paper share model, you don't get paid out how fast you find a block. You get paid out like a constant fee for basically submitting blocks. And so what the miner takes advantage is that he notices that he can earn more profit in the early stage of a proportional pool, but once it starts diminishing way lower than he wants it to be, he moves on to a paper share mining pool where the payouts are more constant and are higher than, I guess, the proportional pool at that stage. Because in a paper share mining pool, the payouts are pretty much constant and they don't like diminish as in a proportional pool. So that's the idea that people exploit. So this was an idea that came about in the early days of Bitcoin when proportional pools kind of existed. Like people learned from that, and those are no longer part of the system. But then, yeah, so that's why like proportional mining pools are not feasible. Yeah, it lends itself to this problem. Yeah.
I think you said like people can free ride by withholding.
Not exactly free ride by withholding. I mean by so they participate in. So this is about pool cannibalization. So in the, I guess, when they're distributing their like extra mining power amongst the rest of the network, what they're essentially doing is they don't want to contribute anything of value. So meaning that when they're trying to mine for these other pools, they don't submit valid blocks, meaning that they don't actually benefit these mining pools at all. They act as that. They act as they're doing work, but then they don't actually do valid work. And what they do is that, or what the pool managers see is that, okay, this guy is doing hashing and they're submitting shares, so I'll reward them for doing this work. So what essentially that they're doing is they're earning rewards on, like, I guess, gaming the system. They're earning rewards on providing like bad blocks to or bad shares to this pool manager, while I guess while every other miner in the 70% mining pool, they'll keep on mining, thinking that, oh, this one person that joined is being an honest miner. So I guess they're free riding in a sense by they're reaping the rewards without actually contributing anything of like value, but I guess it's like a little bit more complicated than that. Yeah.
Why can a pool manager not detect that?
I guess it's hard to detect because you don't. I mean, it's on your end, as in the person who's mining and withholding valid blocks. The pool manager, I guess, isn't really doing the hashing power to like, I guess, they're delegating all the mining puzzle problems to all their miners in their pool, and they don't know if these mining puzzles will be the valid solution to this mining, like, yeah, right. So that's why the pool manager can't tell if he's being a malicious miner or not. He's just accepting all the shares that he gets from all his miners and checking it to see if it works. And if he gets ones that don't work, he'll be like, oh guys, okay, these miners tried, but they didn't find the valid solution, so we'll keep on trying, basically. Okay. I'm gonna move on. So we'll start talking about forking and double spending. So let's redefine what double spending means. So it's basically successfully spending the same asset or the same money more than once, right? So let's have, or here's an example. So like it's the year 2099 and like Jillian wants to buy this new version of the iPhone that isn't even available yet, the iPhone 92XCS or something, right? And then she wants to buy it for like 100 Bitcoin, but she doesn't want to give up her own money. So hashtag HODL. So how can Jillian double spend on it, right? So I'm really naive. So let's say that I'm only looking for a valid transaction to go through. So once I see a valid transaction broadcasted, I immediately send her her iPhone that she wants, right? So this is an incredibly naive scheme, but then this puts me at risk. So this is what Jillian does. So Jillian wants the iPhone, so she sends me a transaction of 100 Bitcoin. I see it as, once I see like the transaction and I think it's valid, and I go like, okay, cool, I'll send you the goods. I'll send you my iPhone, and then Jillian will like go about her way. But what I don't know on the other side is Jillian actually sends a second transaction, right? A transaction that is broadcasted to the rest of the network. So she only sends the transaction of her to me to just ourselves, but then she broadcasts this other transaction to the rest of the network where she just sends it to another one of her own addresses. So what it looks like is I see the transaction from her to me, and I think, okay, cool, I'll send you the iPhone, but then to the rest of the network, she's just sending Bitcoins to herself, right? So that's pretty bad, right? So in the end, when everything gets resolved, she gets to keep her own money, and I lose my iPhone, right? So, and to make sure that her transaction goes through, rather, there's this idea of replace by fees. So if we think about like in, I guess in Bitcoin, we have this idea of a transaction fee, right? Let's say if I put up a higher transaction fee on this one transaction, and miners are more incentivized to validate this transaction. So in that way, if she's sending like 2 transactions at once, the one that she wants to like propagate faster or through, she'll put that with like a higher transaction fee, and then she'll put like my valid transaction with like a really low fee, and then the one that she wants to go through will actually go through, and the one that I want to go through won't. So that's a way to like make sure that her bad transaction goes through. So how do we prevent against this, right? We want this way of, I guess, making sure that a transaction is valid, right, or is final. So we introduced the idea of confirmations, which is the number of blocks that are added on top of a block. If we look at this like diagram, so if we're looking at the leftmost block, it has 2 confirmations because there's 2 more blocks that have been added on top of the blockchain in front of it. So we say that that's 2 confirmations, right? So at the very end, the very last block of the blockchain will have 0 confirmations because no other block has been added to the blockchain, right? So this idea is, it helps, I guess, make sure that your transaction that's in your block is either one more valid or more final, as in you're more sure that it won't change. So if we get back to this double spending problem, let's say instead of not waiting for any like confirmations and immediately looking for a valid transaction that gets propagated to me, let's say I wait for Z confirmations, or actually in this case I'll say Z is like 2. I'll wait for 2 transactions, right? So Jillian will, I guess, send this transaction from her to me, and then once I see 2 blocks added on top of the blockchain, I'll say like, okay, cool, there's 2 confirmations, and then I'll send the goods. I'll send the iPhone, right? But in actuality, I guess Jillian starts mining her own separate chain, or trying to like subvert the network, or subvert the Bitcoin blockchain. So she mines a transaction that has her malicious transaction in it, and also she tries to mine like other transactions on top of it, so that once I send her the good after 2 confirmations, she actually propagates this new chain which has more blocks on top of it, which becomes this longest chain and actually like invalidates my own transaction. So she gets to keep her own money, and then she also gets to keep my iPhone. So when Jillian broadcasts her chain, it invalidates my honest transaction, and then I lose out on this this deal, and she successfully double spends against me, right? So that's one way she can do like a double spend attack, and this is just like the idea of like these probabilities that if you see a number of confirmations, how sure are you that it's actually final, or if some attacker can catch up, right? So the different colors show like how much hash power this attacker has in this network, how much hash power this attacker has, and then the graph shows like the percentage of one probability the attacker will catch up, or the probability that the transaction is safe after k confirmations, right? So if we look on this table, we see that if someone has 50% of the network hash power, they're always able to catch up to the longest chain, no matter what, right? The line above on the top graph, the turquoise one says that no matter what, this person with 50% or more of the hash power, they'll always be able to catch up because that's just the reality, right? So if she does have more than 50% of the hash power in the network, she can catch up and outproduce the honest miners. The example that we give here is that she can basically create her own version of the network by saying, okay, I have more than 51%. I'll just have this network on my own of 51% and always keep mining like my own blocks. And this 49% can't catch up because like they can't produce enough blocks to outpace me. So Jillian can always double spend against me if she has more than 51% of the hash power, and that's very, very bad, right? That's why we always emphasize the idea of a 51% attack, because that's when everything breaks down, all consensus breaks down. So why would Jillian not want a double spend? So there's like the idea of incentives, right? If she successfully double spends and word gets out, people lose faith in the network because supposedly Bitcoin is the first cryptocurrency to solve the double spending problem without like a third party, right? And if people hear that, oh, the double spending problem like is actually not solvable, like the value of Bitcoin drops, and you have so like all her Bitcoin that she gets is like no longer worth that much anymore, right? So what Jillian can do instead is she can actually like short the currency or bet against Bitcoin, the Bitcoin value, and she can also like try to subvert or like try to attack the network without having any stake in the network. So one way she can do that is, one, she can bribe the miners to conduct an attack on her behalf. So at the end of all this attack, she doesn't have this. If the Bitcoin network ends up like crashing or like becoming useless, she has no like ASICs that is like useless garbage to her, right? All the miners in the network end up with like these ASICs that like are no longer useful except for SHA-256, right? And Jillian isn't left with like a pile of a bunch of like useless ASICs. So that's why bribing miners is like one way that you can short like the currency and not hurt from it, right? And you can also bet that, let's say, you can also bet that like the network, the Bitcoin value will drop, and everyone goes like, oh no, it's going to go for 10K, it's going to go for 20K, right? And then when she does that, like she'll be able to earn like an immense amount of profit off of like destroying like the Bitcoin network, right? Any questions? Yeah.
So instead of like making transaction to you, and she would broadcast like to herself and the other chain, she does not broadcast the other transaction at all. She said make it block without that transaction at all happening.
So she actually broadcasts both, because I would have to, in the way that I would end up sending her the good is that I have to see that my transaction is there, as in like the transaction that Jillian sends to me. So I have to see that transaction in order to make sure that I can give her the good. I don't want to give her something when she never sends me money in the first place, right? But then I wait for a number of confirmations to be sure that, oh, this might be final, right? But I don't know that she has like a lot of hash power, and on her end, she ends up mining more blocks than what my confirmation she mines more blocks than the number of confirmations I'm waiting for. So that overtakes this chain that has my honest transaction in it. It overtakes it, and it actually invalidates it per se. So this new chain that she mines with her malicious transaction in it will overtake my own the honest chain with my transaction in it. So she has to broadcast both, and then she has to broadcast both. And for me to for me to actually send the good, I have to see the honest transaction. But at a later time, she can overtake it at any point.
So my question is, it seems like somebody's trying to do this attack they're wrapping this blockchain that's substantially bigger than the honest chain. Wouldn't that be wouldn't the sudden interference of a longer blockchain get tip off them and something suspicious?
Okay, so there's actually one protocol rule in Bitcoin that says that miners who receive blocks out of 2 hours after their mean time, they don't accept it. So someone can't send a miner a block from 2 weeks ago and try to do this kind of attack. They'll only accept blocks within a 2-hour period and then do that. So that's a small protocol rule that Bitcoin has. So we talk about this general idea of an attack because we're talking about proof of work attacks, not specific to just Bitcoin. But Bitcoin does have this protocol rule that stops something like this from happening if it's past a 2-hour period. Yeah.
So I guess my follow-up question to that would be how do you get all these blocks withheld for 2 hours? Seems like it's already kind of hard to get a final block, so you wouldn't have to have really substantial mining power.
Yeah, you need a lot of mining power to actually pull off an attack like this because you need to mine subsequent blocks before anyone else, and you have to mine it faster than everyone else. Yeah. Yeah.
Could you combine this with selfish mining?
So
we'll get to that.
We'll get to that in section 4. Noah will talk about this actually. We'll start talking about censorship first before we get into selfish mining. Okay. So the idea of we have this idea of, let's say you're a government that has a lot of mining power or a lot of jurisdiction over these mining pools. So you have more than 50% of the mining pool power, and I guess we can say that you're China, right? And you don't like whatever this libertarian congressman is saying, so Gary Johnson. So you want to censor all of his transactions. So you want to prevent him from doing any kind of business on the Bitcoin blockchain, right? So these are just representations of what a normal block would look like, a block containing Gary Johnson's transactions, and this is the Chinese blocks, right? So we adopt this naive strategy. How you would try to, blacklist Gary Johnson is just say, okay, whenever I see a Gary Johnson transaction, I just don't want to include it. I won't try to mine that in a block. So this naive solution doesn't actually work, right? It doesn't work unless you're 100% of the network, meaning that you can always follow it up with your own. Mined block, because mining is still kind of a probabilistic kind of game or puzzle solving mechanism. Over time, a miner or a mining pool that's not China will probably bundle a transaction containing or bundle a block together containing Gary Johnson's block, and he'll propagate that, and it'll ruin your this blockchain of only Chinese mined blocks, right? So what this does is it doesn't actually prevent Gary from participating in the network. It only just causes delays and inconveniences. So a normal miner on the network might accidentally bundle a block together with his transaction in it, and it just ruins your plan. So this is a very naive strategy. So we adopt this idea of punitive forking. So you're China, you have more than 51% of the network hash rate. So you tell everyone in the world saying, I don't want to include Gary's transactions in any of my blocks, right? So you mandate all your pools that you control to not bundle any of his transactions into your blocks. So what happens is that once you see a Gary transaction or Gary transaction in a block, you start trying to, I guess, subvert the network and trying to create your own longest chain that will invalidate these Gary Johnson blocks, right? And that will work because you're more than 51% of the network. You'll always be able to outdo this honest minority, right? And other miners see that you're able to overpower them, and they'll be like, if I include Gary Johnson's block in any of my, or if I include any of his transactions in my blocks, it's always going to get invalidated by China. So I might as well just not include his blocks like consciously, so I can guarantee that my blocks in the future I'll still earn like a block reward from that, right? So if I include Gary Johnson's block, will be 100% certain that my block won't get included in the overall longest chain. So I'll just stop including his his transaction in my blocks. So that's the idea of punitive forking, right? So you can enforce this censorship idea if you have more than 51% of that network hash power. But yeah. But let's say, how do we do this with
My
mic went out? One second. Hello? Is that out of battery? I don't think so. I'll just try to talk about it.
Your man.
Yeah, wait, turn it on.
You do that. I'll see.
Okay, so let's say as China, I have more than 51% of the hash power, but let's say half of my ASIC farm burns down, and I'm left remaining with 20% of the hash power, right? How can I still try to censor Gary Johnson's transactions with this lower amount of hash power, right? So there's this idea of feather forking. So this strategy is that we attempt to fork when we see a transaction with a block with Gary's transaction, but then because we have less hash power, we can't be for sure that we'll always be able to fork this network. So we say that we'll attempt to fork, but we can't always be sure that we'll fork, and then we'll give up after, let's say, some number of transactions. Let's say we get undone by the honest majority now, right? So the idea is that in feather forking, I have this lower probability of, I guess, orphaning Gary Johnson's block. So let's say we have this probability Q that's like 0.2, and we'll give up after one confirmation. So one more block. If we get outdone by one extra block, we'll just stop. So if our network hash power rate is around 20%, the chance of that we invalidate Gary's Johnson block, the Gary Johnson block, is around 4%. That's not a very good chance, right? So we still adopt this idea of, we announce to the world that we'll attempt to fork, but we'll attempt to fork, but we can't be certain that we'll actually subvert the network. But other miners see this announcement that you make, and they see that, okay, if I include Gary Johnson's block, right? If I include Gary Johnson's block, I have this small percentage that I won't get the block reward. Versus if I don't include his block, I'll be for sure that if I don't include his transaction, I'll be for sure to get this block reward. My block won't get invalidated. So the analogy I like to use is you have two bowls of M&Ms, right? You have bowl A and bowl B, but I put one poison M&M in, let's say, this A bowl, right? So I tell you that you can eat from either M&M jar or M&M bowl, but you don't want to eat from bowl A because you have this small percentage that you'll get poisoned, right? Versus you have a 100% chance of staying safe or continue living if you eat from bowl B, right? So this idea that miners have is that I have this small percentage that my block will be invalidated. I might as well just not include Johnson's transaction. So that's the idea that feather forking enforces, is that the small percentage is enough to, I guess, incentivize other miners to not include the Gary Johnson's transactions, unless Gary Johnson has a high enough transaction fee that can outdo this like block reward, right? So if we do like all the calculations and whatnot, so we see that like Gary Johnson needs 0.5 Bitcoin as a transaction fee as a minimum to include his transactions. So that's not very feasible for any of it. That's not very feasible. So this will also, I guess, successfully censor Gary from participating in the network and conducting any Bitcoin transactions. Yeah.
Why isn't the transaction fee like multiplied by 1 minus
What is the transaction fee? Because the transaction fee is like this flat fee. It's so like the reward that a miner gets after he successfully mines a block is he'll get the transaction fee associated with mining Gary Johnson's block, but then it's the other part is it's multiplied by the reward the probability that their block is not invalidated, which is 1 minus q squared. Because let's say I have a 4% or I have a 4% chance of orphaning this Gary Johnson block. So meaning that there's a 4% chance that this block will not get included or will get invalidated. So the block reward, the expected value of me getting this block reward is around 96%, right? So I have a 96% chance of having this block successful, and I need this Gary Johnson transaction fee to like outweigh like the loss that I'll get if this transaction doesn't go through or this block doesn't go through.
Don't transaction fees count kind of like a block reward?
Yeah, so it
Doesn't that transaction fee also have like 4% chance of being offered?
So that's a good question. If the transaction does not get included, I guess so the question is why is the transaction fee that Johnson provides why is that like a flat fee that's added after the block reward? Yeah.
Oh.
Basically,
Yeah.
if the miner doesn't include the transaction, he does not collect the fee. And I mean, the 4% is not a chance. We know for sure either we include it or not include it.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. So there is no like 4% multiplier. We know for sure.
Okay, does that answer your
Yeah.
question? Yeah.
I have my own question.
Yeah.
Why is it q squared? I guess we're assuming that if we mine 2 blocks on the separate fork, then everyone else will switch to our fork. But what if I'm not sure how it will work? What if everyone else will wait for like 3, 4, or more blocks on the separate fork? That will increase the power of Q, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we're assuming that we're only waiting for another block to get added to the chain. So we're waiting for one additional block or one additional confirmation. If let's say we're waiting for 5 confirmations, it becomes like q to the 6th, because you have to successfully mine 6 blocks in a row basically, right? And the probability of that happening gets lower and lower as you go on. So in our example, it's q squared because we're only waiting for one more confirmation. If you're waiting for more confirmations, it gets exponentially smaller. Yeah.
So I guess I'm still kind of confused about how you would know a transaction is from a specific person. Like how would you be able
in this example, let's just say we know which addresses belong to Gary Johnson, right? Let's say he's like a public entity. He says, I do business on these 10 addresses, right? And this idea of censorship works also even if he publicizes his account. If he also like creates an account like privately after China starts trying to, I guess, after China starts publicly like denying him any like business on the network, if he creates another account to get around this new account doesn't have any like Bitcoin to start off with unless he buys more. So he has to like either to either like participate in the network, he has to create a new account and like buy in so that he doesn't get censored, because any funds that were locked into, let's say his 10 previous accounts, those can't be touched because his transactions will always be like censored. Yeah.
Yeah. So what is that stop blacklisting attack?
Or which attack? The blacklisting is the naive attack where you just say that I don't want to include any of these blocks, but then on average, someone might still mine a block containing his transaction and propagate that to the network.
I
So
meant the one with just the previous one.
The
you announced.
the feather forking. Okay. So so what was your exact question again?
Like, what is that to prevent this?
What is there to prevent this?
Like, why doesn't this happen?
So we'll get into like I guess defenses with Noah. He'll tell you how I guess what like defenses can be like implemented to like prevent against a lot of these like because when you're trying to fork you're doing some sort of like selfish mining kind of deal. So he'll get into selfish mining and he'll talk about a little bit about the defenses for that. Is that okay? Okay. So we have a break for like 5-10 minutes.
5 minutes, yeah.
Or 5 minutes, yeah. Want to play something?
Yeah.
The mic doesn't work.
So we actually looked at the music that you all suggested at the first lecture. This is the first actual music suggestion, so we're going to listen to it. Somebody just said whatever we're playing, so I dig that. Sorry, we don't go over feather forking defenses, but I'm thinking about why it doesn't happen. I mean, there's ways of anonymizing people. So like, say somebody sees your public address and they're like they know it's you, and they're like, I don't want this person to ever carry out a site. That's feather forking to all miners. There's going to be a lot of miners that just don't agree with that, like ideologically. They're like, okay, I'll take the loss. It's not what they're talking about. But even past that, say that happened to you, what you can do is you can create a new private key, public key address and Bitcoin address. And then once you created that, you could kind of do this like option method to anonymize the Bitcoin in your old account. So one way to do that would be, have you heard of Facebook? Oh yeah, sure. Perfect. I didn't even notice. That's a really cool logo. I dig it. Yeah, so exactly. Use fake incentives. Just exchange your Bitcoin for something else and then change that back. Yeah, but I mean, still, I would say if you're like at serious risk, like it's pretty easy. It would take less than 15 minutes. Basically anonymize all your cryptocurrency. Just include the Litecoin and then with that. Oh, it's all in one. It's very, like, I would say, I can make it. I think there was one of those. Yeah. Did you see the? Yeah, but when you wait, but it could be one. You see what I mean? Let me ask. You can make new accounts. I mean, there's more of a concept of identity. Right, like it's not accountable. But I mean, in a naive system where your account is just directly tied to like the only way of ownership is through having the same address as the person who created it. That's not the only way to do ownership. You can have accounts that will like actually allow the ability to transfer ownership. But I would say one, like I haven't heard of this attack happening. Like
I guess it's pretty obvious.
yeah, just ideologically. Yeah, people, I don't know, I feel like they would ideologically oppose it. But also, even that said, I don't know, there might be, like, it might be going on, it's hard to gauge.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, that's interesting.
It's kind of the same as, like, cannibalizing pools, where it's difficult to actually tell if well, with feather forking, I guess not, because they publicly announce it.
Yeah.
But so far as I know, there's nobody that's, like, publicly announced it and is, yeah, doing it right now.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I think it's time to hop into it. Oh, wrong choice. Yo. I found batteries. It says supplies. Hopefully it works. I'm gonna just like kill the microphone.
So no, with this cannibalization, you kind of get diminishing returns. Like it works to do it 1% because you're getting a tiny portion, but it wouldn't make sense.
No, so far as I know, like you can still like I don't know what the optimal strategy for cannibalizing pools is, but like if you were to gain another % of like hash power and just put it into like pools again, it would just be 2 over 70, 2 over 72, I guess. It makes sense up until
But the opportunity becomes bigger because you have been using that 2%.
true. Like I don't know what the optimal strategy is, but it's not just like 1% is a cutoff. I don't believe.
Right, not 1%, but like, it makes sense to cannibalize big
Test.
proportion is a lot smaller than
Let's talk about this after. Yeah. I cannot get the mic to work. That's an issue. Test. Nope. Oh, that makes sense. Test. Cool, we're going to start in 1 moment. How's this sound? Is this a good volume for people? Can people in the back hear? Cool. All right, we are going to return from the break right now. So I'm going to cover selfish mining. And before I jump into it, could we have quiet in the room, please? People in the front talking? Sorry, we're continuing the lecture. You can talk after class. Come up if you have questions. So we're going to talk a little bit about selfish mining and why a miner might choose to do it. And I'd like to tie this back to the Bitcoin IRL lecture, where we discussed the motivation for all actions just in general. The basis of game theory is people want to maximize their profits. They want to maximize what they're getting out of a system. And selfish mining is no different. It's a way for a miner with equal input to get more output. So they're essentially maximizing what they're taking from the system, but they're not necessarily following protocol. So selfish mining, in a definitional sense, is you're mining and you've just found a block. And instead of announcing that block to the world and immediately receiving the Coinbase transaction, that award for finding the block and whatever transaction fees that might entail, you keep it secret and you just immediately start mining on that block. That's called selfish mining. It's block withholding. It's that term block withholding is also used in the context of mining pools. It's a similar idea, but it's not exactly the same. I'll just use selfish mining for the rest of the lecture. So if you succeed in finding that second block, you've essentially fooled the network. It still believes it's mining on the longest chain, but they're not. You've got the longest chain on your own. You've got this 2-block advantage on the rest of the network. And can anybody maybe see why this would give you an advantage over everybody else? Does anybody have any ideas? Yes. Well, yeah, because it's the longest one. But why does having the longest chain all to yourself give you this advantage? Darius.
It gives you more time to find the hash of the block compared to everyone else.
Exactly. So because you're the only person that's got that longest chain, you're effectively 100% of the hash power on that chain. Nobody else can try and solve it. They don't even know it exists. So you've got a greater opportunity to get the solution and find the next block because nobody else is even trying to find the next block from that chain. So if you're in the process of finding more blocks on your 2-block secret chain and the network finds a block, they've just increased their chain length, so it's just one less than yours. What you can do is you can immediately publish the 2 blocks that you have, and because your chain is longer, it's got more solutions, then it's immediately accepted. Does that make sense? Because it's the longest chain, people immediately view it as the most valid. And essentially by doing this, you've created, as Darius pointed out, you've created free time for you mining to find the next solution. So you've got a higher proportion of that hash rate, you've got a higher expected profit. Are there any questions on how selfish mining works? Yes?
So my question is, for how long can you withhold the blocks before you have to publish them? Because like apparently there's like a time limit. It's the protocol accepted. So how long do you realistically have to like do this?
So as Brian mentioned earlier, there's that 2-hour limit in protocol. So if you try and give a miner a chain that starts with a block that's over 2 hours old, then they'll be like, hey, wait a second, this doesn't work. Even considering that this is an asynchronous system that people are all over, this doesn't make sense, and they won't accept it. So if you're holding your blocks for more than 2 hours before publishing your chain, you've effectively just played yourself.
But wouldn't the time depend on the timestamp of your latest block though? And if you're running in parallel, like you could have forked more than 2 hours ago?
You could have forked more than 2 hours ago, but the issue is a miner is going to look at that block that forks off more than 2 hours ago and say, that's not an effective block, so all the solutions built on top of this are not, not effective, but rather not a valid block. So all the solutions built on top of this are no longer considered valid, even if they're in that time frame. Yeah. Yes?
And then my second question is, maybe just look at the time frame of like the longest chain and say, wait a minute, why wasn't this earlier block published when it was immediately found? Why wasn't it published? Would it be evident at all, or would it just like?
It's an interesting question. In the ecosystem of like blockchains, you expect some level of time delay between different nodes. Bitcoin is founded on, or like one of the assumptions is that it's an asynchronous system. Not everybody is in the same time frame. So even though it might be a little bit suspicious if one person is always submitting these chains and like kind of beating out the longer chain, it's difficult to really say whether they're malicious or not. So moving on, we only considered the case where you find your 2 blocks before the network has even found one. And then if they find one, you publish it. But what happens if you found your block, you're searching for your second block, and then the network finds a valid solution? So now there's 2 valid solutions at the same height. Your block that you've held onto, and then the network's block. So in this case, what you have to do is essentially, as the malicious miner, so I guess maybe not you, I'd hope that you're all moral and upstanding and you want to maintain the Bitcoin ecosystem. But what a malicious miner would do is they would race to propagate their block as quickly as possible. Because if they can get 50% of miners behind it, 50% including themselves, it's going to have more hash power on it, and more likely than not, it's going to be the accepted chain. So they'll still be able to get that reward. They'll still get the one Coinbase transaction. So they're not necessarily losing out if they choose to withhold their block and then another block is published. They have to win this race to propagate, and they can still keep that Coinbase transaction. Another important point to consider is not getting too deep into the math. There's an entire paper on this if you want to read about it. But if you have more than 33% of the mining power, then it doesn't actually matter if you win that race to propagate, because your average expected return will still be greater than if you act honestly in the system. And that has a little bit to do with how quickly you'd expect to find those 2 blocks in a row. I don't want to get too much into the math, like I said. If you're interested in the paper, come up afterwards, we can talk about it. So are there any questions on what I've just described about selfish mining? Any clarifications? Yeah, Mitchell.
What does the find a block, find the network, or find a block by myself? What is it?
Could you rephrase the question?
Like you mentioned, like it's not a malicious miner. I'm competing with the entire network.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate on this? What does this mean?
Oh, sure. So your question is about what it means to be going against the rest of the network as a malicious miner. So the idea is, with this selfish mining, you have a block that you're keeping secret to yourself, and you're still trying to continue that chain on, while the honest network is trying to continue the chain that they think is the longest on. So does that clarify it a little bit, or?
But how do you keep a chain secret?
Oh, okay. So as a similar idea to with pools, that idea of block withholding, where when you find a valid solution, you don't actually send it to the pool. Think of the same situation, except you're just not sending it to the rest of the Bitcoin miners. So if I were to find a valid solution as a malicious miner that's partaking in selfish mining, what I would do is, when I find a solution, I wouldn't immediately broadcast it out. I just hold on to it, keep mining based on that. Yeah. Yes, so there is that 2-hour limit, so you can't keep your chain private. You can't keep the initial block private past 2 hours, otherwise nobody will accept it. Yeah. Yes?
So I guess another question is there any other easy way to prevent this, to be like force the block to be published as soon as the solution is found? Why can't you do that?
We'll get into defenses. Actually, it's the next section. I can't say immediately why that wouldn't work, but I would guess, this is just my hypothesis, if you're going to make code that will try and enforce that, people will find ways around it. In fact, this lecture should seem, or this train of developments should almost seem similar to when we were talking about ASICs before. It's like people come up with ways that you can maybe avoid having selfish mining, and then other people come up with craftier ways to selfishly mine. So there's always that aspect of, it's just your solution is being tested in every way. So even if you come up with something that seems like it might work, somebody's probably going to develop a way to be malicious again. Any other questions? Yes.
Any empirical work or statistics, how often this is actually occurring, selfish mining and the attacks we saw in the pool?
I don't know if there's any statistical surveys, but if you're more interested in the math side of it, I would recommend looking into the selfish mining paper. There was I don't know who the authors are offhand, but if you Google selfish mining paper, I think it's even referenced in here. You'll be able to find some better information on how it happens. Yeah. That said, I would look up, if you're interested, look up how often it happens. I don't have an answer for that right now. Yeah. So moving on to defenses. And in the same way that people are always going to be motivated to cheat the system and make more, honest miners are always going to be motivated to come up with new systems that might make it more difficult to cheat, or in their view, at first, impossible to cheat. It's basically a continuous struggle. And so I will progress through the defenses from the most naive defense to the most sophisticated as of currently defense. So the most basic defense that you can have against selfish mining is you can have all of the blocks that are posted out into the network accompanied with signatures. And these signatures are supposed to represent the amount of the network that has seen that block already. And it's a kind of a proof that the block has been witnessed by other people. And it proves that there's another block, or excuse me, it proves that there's maybe like not a competing block present before miners start to work on like a new block. And the idea there is essentially you'd sign the first block that you see, and then start working on it, and you broadcast it out, and it's kind of like a fail-safe. But does anybody see like the immediate issue here with having these signatures on blocks? Yes.
If you have enough mining power, you can just use your own mining power, so it's signing one block.
Exactly. You can just create these signatures yourself. There's no easy way to determine like who should be able to sign. So if it's as simple as just using a private key to sign off, then somebody can just Sybil attack it, create a lot of signatures on their own block, and then broadcast it. And then it gives it like this air of legitimacy, even though it hasn't changed at all. And there's also the issue of it would have to include fundamental changes to how Bitcoin works. You'd have to provide a way for people to actually sign these blocks. So it would change a lot of how the system works currently. And it wouldn't even really do that much. And it also does not provide a way of determining like how many signatures is enough. Like, is 200 enough? Is 2,000 enough? Like, what order of magnitude would you want? So that, paired along with the Sybil attack, basically renders this as a useless defense. But does everybody see what it's trying to do? Thumbs up? Cool. Moving on. So another possible defense suggested by Lair Bahak is that if you have two competing blocks, essentially if you have a fork, both of those blocks don't receive any reward. And then the first miner who incorporates a proof of block fork into their solution for the next block will get half of the forfeited reward. So they'll get a typical Coinbase transaction award. And basically, it's just a way to acknowledge a fork and then make it so that the forking parties are not benefiting at all. And that will dissuade selfish mining because it won't incentivize you to have those forks happen because you won't get any reward. But does anybody see issues with this system? What's the biggest issue? There's like a fundamental change. Shouldn't.
Bitcoin are just destroyed.
but elaborate. Why would Bitcoin be destroyed completely?
Like a set amount of Bitcoin can never be mined. So if like you have two blocks that are now competed, then on one chain you have a block that didn't have a Coinbase transaction at all. So it's like removing 50 or like 25 or 12.5 Bitcoins in the number of Bitcoin that can.
So that's a specific example of what would happen. And basically the idea that you're getting to is you have to fundamentally change how Bitcoin works. Because you'd have to make it so if there are these forks, then the two people that are forking, or however many people are forking, wouldn't get any reward. Which you'd essentially have to like erase that Coinbase transaction. So yeah, thank you for sharing. Yeah, and so another huge issue with it is that, say you've got two honest miners that find a solution at the same time, they both publish it. Now they're both out that Coinbase transaction, that reward that they're promised for mining. So you're basically you're depriving these people that honestly followed the rules of their reward. If it's just a fluke, if there was no actual attempt at malicious mining. And as Shivan mentioned, it requires a fundamental change to how the Coinbase transaction is awarded, which would require a hard fork to implement. And thinking about like how hard forks are implemented, you need to have that miner consensus. Do you think miners would agree to maybe losing out on their profits? Doesn't make sense. It wouldn't happen. Is there a better system that we can use? There are more. We'll keep going through them. So the next is this idea of tie breaking. So if you have a miner that gets more than one block, that miner will randomly choose which one to mine on, essentially. And this makes it so that there's no race to propagate, so that there is a race to propagate, but rather the selfish miner, if they have a network advantage, they can get their block out to more people. It's not like they can just immediately do that and then win the race to propagate. Miners will instead randomly choose. So it kind of cuts down on the profitability, because even if you have like a really strong network advantage as a selfish miner, you're not necessarily going to get the longest chain. And so this raises the profit threshold from 0% to 25% under that strategy. So essentially, you're not going to expect to make as much. There's a bigger risk of not profiting as a selfish miner. There's actually more optimal selfish mining strategies that you can use, and it will decrease that threshold that the selfish miner has to get to, that profitability that they have to achieve. Does anybody see any issues with this scheme?
Can you end up like invalidating some of their transactions by chance, so it's still not like an ideal solution to the problem?
Yeah, you could end up accidentally invalidating transactions. There's another issue, which is how do you decide what time frame is acceptable to like accept these blocks? Are you going to do like 50 seconds? Are you going to do 2 minutes? Like it all comes down to somewhat arbitrary decisions. Building off of this idea of tie breaking, you could try and incorporate, say, a timestamp. And then using that timestamp, you can only accept blocks that are the most fresh, the most recent. And that timestamp would be publicly accessible. All the miners would be able to see it and use it. And it would be unpredictable in some sense. So it would be issued, regularly, but it wouldn't necessarily be issued in a way that people could replicate it beforehand. Like, say, I know that say it were released on the minute every 60 seconds and there were no other caveat to it. As a selfish miner, I could just assume, like, hey, it's going to take me a couple minutes to mine this block. I'm just going to bet that I'll publish it by around 6:33 or whatever. Then in that case, like, I've gotten around the system. But no. So the way it's not totally naive in how the timestamp is published. It's like cryptographically signed, say, in some way, so that you can't just guess what the timestamp is going to be. And in this scheme, when 2 blocks are received within 120 seconds, miners prefer the block that is more fresh. And this raises that profit threshold that a malicious miner needs to make for this scheme to be profitable, or for selfish mining to be profitable under this scheme. Does anybody see issues with this timestamp idea? Any new voices? We've gotten a lot of answers from the front. Anybody in the back? Yeah.
Well, I guess miner, he finds a block, he can just hold it, wait for some other block to be posted, then post it later with the fresher timestamp.
Well, the issue is the timestamp would be incorporated into your proof of work puzzle. So if you try and incorporate a new timestamp, it's going to change the solution. Your old nonce will not work. So there's a big one here. What's one of the buzzwords you hear about blockchain all the time? Decentralized. And so what does this do? This introduces a point of centralization. Well, actually, I skipped a slide. We'll get to centralization in a moment. So some other drawbacks with this are that this tie-breaking scheme doesn't actually apply if the selfish miner gets just a longer chain in general. So say they find those 2 blocks and the network has found 1 block. If they publish their 2 blocks, everybody in the network is going to say, okay, I don't care that this chain is not as fresh as this new block. I see that it's longer. It's got more proof of work behind it. So I'm going to accept that as valid. And another issue is that if the attacker has a large amount of hash power, like, say some of these pools, or if you were to somehow, take over all of the hash power in China, like these defenses would be useless. Are there any questions about those? Okay, cool. So moving on, getting to the point I was making a few moments ago, this introduces centralization to a system that we're trying to make as decentralized as possible. If there are options to avoid trusting others, avoid trusting some central entity to give, a fair timestamp out, we'd prefer to do that. We'd prefer to have this algorithmically, solved, as opposed to having some central entity that will be the solution. So that's a big issue with this. It's introducing that centralization again. So this brings me to the most recent development in selfish mining, or rather defenses to it, in an idea called publish or perish. And the idea behind publish or perish is it incentivizes, or rather it does not incentivize withholding a block. You, by holding your block, will not actually get any advantage as compared to the main chain. And why this works, I'll go through it in more detail. This is actually a very technical scheme. So if you need me to slow down or if you want to ask any questions, go for it. In fact, just like raise your hand, in the middle of it, because there's going to be a few. So the idea is it looks at the fork resolving policy that Bitcoin has, and it replaces the original Bitcoin fork resolving policy with a weighted FRP. And so the idea is you'll embed in the block that you're working on hashes of all the uncle blocks. And you might have heard the term uncle before in Ethereum. This is actually a different definition. I'll go into it in a moment. And this idea of selfish mining, it's important to underscore that it's predicated on the fact that you're building this secret chain. So that's what this is trying to oppose against. It's trying to make sure that that secret block doesn't actually help the selfish miner at all. So going into it, there are a few definitions. So first off, we're going to define tau. Tau is an assumed upper bound on the amount of time it takes to propagate a block across the entire Bitcoin network. And so the main idea here is tau is tied into this concept of in time, which is 2 blocks are in time if, like after the first block is published, the second block is published in tau time to that first block. Or 2 blocks are in time as if the height of like one block is greater than the height of the other block, and they're the only blocks, those blocks are considered in time. Yeah. And in time is all from the miner's perspective. So say you see a new block that's built off of the block that you were mining on, and you see that it's got a height that's +1 to the block that you were working on. That block is in time, so you accept it. You accept that chain as having that block's weight. Are there any questions? Any clarifications? Anything that's just not sticking right? I hear, I'm lost. I see it's being mouthed. Okay, so I'm going to jump into the next definitions, and then after that, we'll run through some examples to kind of explain the different cases. So, yeah. So, like I said, there's also this idea of an uncle block. This is different from Ethereum's definition, which I don't know if we went over in the Ethereum lecture. We didn't. Okay, so the idea of an uncle block is it's 1 less than the height of the block that is like the current block in the chain, and it has to be in time with whatever other blocks were published at that height. So, for example, say, well, this might even be easier to draw, so I'm going to do that. Actually, I'm going to point at that, because I don't want to draw that all out. So if you look up there, you see the parent was the first block published. So that's automatically in time, because it's 1 more than the height of the previous block, right? So that makes sense. And then the one below it that's labeled uncle, it was published within tau time of the parent block. So that means it's in time. But if you look at the one that's labeled not uncle, it's not within that tau time. It's actually beyond that field of time, whatever that arbitrary tau is. And the child is a height +1 of those blocks. So it's in time with the parent block, but it's not really considered in the uncle, not uncle thing. And it's important to realize that all of like the uncle, not uncle terminology, that's in regards to that child block. Does that make sense? Any questions? Yes, Minji.
Well, what is the term height?
In time?
No, height.
Oh, height. So height is essentially the length of the blockchain, right? So in this case, we could describe it as like height is, for that first block, we'll say it's 0. Then the block that comes immediately after it is 1. And then the parent block is 2. And then the child block is 3. And so for the uncle and not uncle block, the height would be the same as the parent block. Yes?
So how is the height of uncle and child different?
Yeah, so how is the height of the uncle and the child different was the question. So if you look at the child block, it's got 3 blocks preceding it in the system, right? So it's got the parent of the parent, and the parent of the parent's parent. That's a mouthful. And then the uncle and the not uncle don't have that parent block. So their height is 1 less than the child.
Any other questions? Yes. Yeah.
In time is defined by the miner, or like is it local to every miner?
Yes, it's from the miner's perspective. So it's a way that every miner can determine whether they should accept a block or not. So they don't have to trust anybody else. Okay, are we good on definitions? I'm going to jump into how this actually works. Cool. So there's this, what's called the weighted fork resolving policy. If one chain is longer height-wise than the others by k or greater blocks, then a miner will just outright accept it. They'll say, this has got to be valid, it's much longer. And so the idea there is, say you're to set an arbitrary limit of 100 blocks, and you see a chain that is 100 blocks longer than every other chain, you're probably going to be able to just outright accept that and say, okay, well, this is valid, or the system is totally broken, in which case, what am I going to do anyway? So the only case that you'd see that, like, a chain longer than 100 blocks, and you'd expect there was malicious activity, is if there was a 51% attack, and there's just somebody with so much hash power that they've totally destroyed the system. So otherwise, you could probably trust it to be a valid chain. Does that make sense? Cool. So otherwise, the miner will look at the chain with the largest weight. And weight is defined according to what we were just talking about with the in-time blocks. I'll get into that more in a moment. And if the largest weight is achieved by multiple chains, then the miner will just arbitrarily choose among those chains which ones to mine on. This says randomly, but I believe it's just totally up to the miner how they decide. But ideally, it would be randomly. And so K is essentially like a fail-safe parameter. In that first definition, it's in the case of network partition, and like say you drop out of the network for a few hours, and you come back and there's a chain that's 20 longer than all the rest of the chains. You don't want to like spend time figuring out which chain is valid. It's probably that one that's longer. So if your value for K is 20, you just outright accept that 20 longer chain. Does that, yeah?
So if it's 19, what do? You go back and review all three?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, if there's only a chain that's 19 longer than all the rest of the chains, then you'd go through step 2 and step 3. And since step 3 can apply because, actually, excuse me, it could apply. So you basically just go through the next 2 steps, which I'll get into further depth in the next question. Yes?
Can we go back to the definition
Of weight, yes. Oh, sorry, I think I totally skipped over that. So to jump into weight, since 2 competing chains always have a shared root, you're only going to consider the blocks that come after that root. And that can include both uncles and also like the children, if that makes, or excuse me, in this scheme it would just be the uncles you're considering, if that makes sense, and then the number of in-time blocks. So yeah.
So if I'm understanding weight correctly, what would happen is like the uncle would retroactively be incorporated into the larger chain?
It's not necessarily incorporated into it. I mean, in the sense that you'll acknowledge that that uncle exists. And if you acknowledge that that uncle exists, if you have the hash of that uncle block, then that chain will have more weight. If that makes sense. Are people a little bit shaky on the definition of weight? I can go into it a little bit more. Thumbs? Thumbs up? Thumbs sideways? Or thumbs down for your understanding? Seems like people are a little bit shaky on weight. So the idea here is if we're looking up there, say that child block incorporated a hash of the uncle block, right, that is in time with the parent, and the not uncle block. If it incorporated those hashes and said, like, I'm acknowledging that these blocks exist, it will have more weight than if it doesn't incorporate those. And it might not make immediate sense as to how that actually resolves the selfish mining, but I'm going to get into 2 cases in a moment. Yes?
How does the incorporation happen? Is it going to be like some transaction included in the block, or the hash of the uncle block will be part of the hash of the child block?
Are you asking how they verify?
Yeah, how do you actually include that information?
Mm-hmm. So you can include the hash of the uncle's block header. Yeah.
Where?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure offhand. We can follow up and post a note. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Why do you need an uncle when you have a parent?
The uncle, you don't necessarily need it, but by showing, like by incorporating that hash of the uncle, you're basically saying, like, I've seen that this work has happened, and it ties into that idea of weight. And I'll get into some examples that'll make it more clear. Yes.
So pretty much you wanna have like the alcohol and the alcohol you have like more like blockers.
Could you repeat the question?
If you have like the no alcohol and alcohol included in your high, you just have the blockers, so validate it.
It's not that they'll validate it instantly. They're still, following the same rules to make sure the block is valid, but rather they'll look at that extra weight of you saying, I see these uncles, as opposed to if your block didn't say that, and there were another block that did say, I see these uncles. It's kind of like it comes back to this idea of a timestamp, but you're using blocks that you've seen previously as your timestamp to kind of say, like, I know for sure that this block that this guy is posting has come after these other blocks. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Question. So in that mission weight, there's an uncle that embedded in the block has to be in time as well. You don't have to.
So the uncles that are embedded in the block definitionally are in time with the parent. Like if you look up there, the not uncle is out of time, so it is not an uncle. Yeah. And then the number of in-time blocks, I believe that actually can also include like a block that is at a different height, but I'll follow up on that. Okay, so moving on into the cases. There's a lot on this slide. Don't worry, we're going to break it down into more. But to just go over it briefly, the two different cases are, they basically tie into the options that the miner has. So the miner has, in this case, say one secret block. And a competing block is published. And they have this situation where they need to decide, am I going to try and propagate my block faster, or am I going to try and keep my block secret? Those are the two options. So if they publish their block to the network, the next honest block will incorporate that hash of the uncle into its block, and it'll add weight to that main chain. So essentially, that main chain will have the one block it already found that it was building off of, the one block that's been published, and then an added one more weight for that selfish block that it saw, and then published a proof of inclusion, or a proof of having seen it, essentially, a proof of that hash. So it'll have a weight of 3. And that means that the selfish chain, which was just one block at this point, will have another block built off of it, right? And that'll give it a weight of 2, which is less than that main chain. So the selfish miner would actually have to create a third block to equal the 2 blocks that have been published by the main network in terms of weight. I'll get into that a little bit more in a second. If it's not totally clear, don't worry, there's more. The second option is if the selfish miner keeps their block secret, the secret block does not contribute to the weight of its own chain, because in this case, it'll be published out of time with the parent block. All the other miners will look at it. They'll say, that block is actually out of time. We're not going to consider that a valid weight in this system, or in this situation rather. And so again, even if the main chain incorporates a hash of that, since it's out of time, it doesn't matter. The main chain will have that one block it found, and then if it finds another block, it'll have a weight of 2. And then the selfish chain, it will start off with a weight of 0, because the block that it published out of time does not count for weight. They'd have to find 2 more blocks to make their chain equal the weight of the honest chain. So to get more into those examples, because it's a lot to go through in just one slide, we're going to look at choice 1 more specifically. So if you look at the diagram itself, just the key is saying that a triangle shows how a block will count in the weight of public chain, and the circle is how it will count in the weight of the selfish miner's chain. So at a very high level, you can see that the selfish block that was withheld up until that race to propagate, it counts in the weight of both chains. So it's not giving the miner a unique vantage. It counts into both. There's no gained time, essentially, on the miner's side. Yeah, and that's part of that main idea I was talking about earlier. These defenses are seeking to eliminate that advantage from withholding blocks. So in the case where they immediately publish after seeing the network's blocks, they actually don't gain any advantage in terms of the weight of their chain. So miners are not more likely to accept it as valid. Does that make sense? Are there any questions on case one? And I'll take any questions. Yeah, Lucas.
How do miners communicate when they have to take decisions on this? I imagine they're spread all across the globe, and these decisions have to be taken very quickly. I guess they don't get on the phone, so how do they do that?
That's actually a really good point. So Bitcoin, you want it to be as little delegation of trust to other people as possible. So it's not actually like the miners are all communicating with each other. In fact, this is founded on the assumption that it is from the miner's local perspective, if you look at that in-time definition. So basically, a miner is making a judgment call. They're saying, do I consider this block in time? And if they don't consider it in time, then it'll have no weight. If they do consider it in time, it will have weight. And then they're looking at the solutions that, to the cryptographic puzzle that people are publishing, and they're determining the weight of that chain based on whether they consider those previous blocks in time or out of time, and whether they incorporate those hashes of uncles.
So each of them makes his own individual decision,
Mm-hmm.
and then the majority coincidentally converges towards a decision that this is the one they want to endorse and the other one, right?
Exactly. Yes. So everybody is coming to a decision on their own, but given the assumptions of the system, we would expect people to converge on the honest chain. So getting back to, it's actually, I would like to make the point here that if you look at the honest chain, there's only 2 blocks there, right? So in both cases, there's 2 blocks being built off the parent, there's a chain of 2 being built off that parent in the honest network. But in the selfish network, there's a chain of 3 blocks. So the selfish miner has to put in more work to get to the same level of weight, which is an important point. So the second option that we were talking about before is that the selfish miner doesn't actually publish S in time with the block that the network has published. They publish it later as a part of their own selfish chain when they find more blocks. And so in that situation, honest miners would look at that block S and they'd say, this doesn't count. It's not in time with the other block at that height. It's a late block. It has no weight. So in that case, it doesn't actually lend any weight to the selfish miner's chain. And the selfish miner's chain essentially has a weight of 0. It's as if it never built off that parent block. So it's like that withheld block doesn't add any value to their own chain. And they'd still have to find, in this case, if the honest chain has 2 more blocks, they'd still have to find another 2 blocks to catch up, which would mean they'd have to find 3 blocks in total, which is more work. Does that make sense? So the main idea is giving miners a way to make a judgment call on whether a block is fair, in a sense, if it was published in a reasonable time frame to the other blocks. Are there any questions? In terms of understanding, how do people feel? Cool. Are you a little bit shaky? Do you have any questions? Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll get into a little bit more of just why this is a good system. So, like I was saying before, it emphasizes this fact that under the system, no withheld blocks will give an undue advantage, because honest miners will either have a way of saying that shouldn't have any weight because it wasn't published within a fair amount of time, or they can incorporate proof of knowledge of that block into their own chain and say, I deserve to have an additional weight. So it's either both the honest miner and the selfish, or the honest chain and the selfish chain get the weight of this block, or neither do. And it nullifies the advantage of that secret block. So here are some graphs on the expected revenue of different K values, and K was the arbitrary block acceptance. Like after a certain point, you just accept the blocks, and that's versus the miner's power share. So if you notice, the larger that you make K, that is, the longer that you evaluate the weight of the chains in this way, the less that a selfish miner would expect to make. So it makes it more difficult for them to get a profit that they shouldn't. But it's also important to notice that after around 25% of that hash power share, the selfish miner will still trend towards making like a significant amount more than they should. Because even in this system, if you look at it, it's like a very gradual exponential increase. So selfish mining is still the most effective way, or one of an effective way to increase your revenue. It's not like the system has totally disincentivized it, but it's made it more difficult to pull off. And you've got a higher profit margin that you have to make. And then looking at the graph on the right, it's a comparison of some of these different defenses. So if you notice, there's this ideal line, which is if the selfish miner never made more than they should. There's publish or perish and optimal tie breaking, which are kind of like neck and neck for the first bit. Optimal tie breaking is a little bit better. The idea of optimal tie breaking is if every time an honest miner got a block, they were able to just say, this one is valid, wasn't made maliciously. This one was made maliciously, I'm going to accept the valid one. And like they've just got some amazing algorithm that will immediately decide that. And then for the publish or perish method, it actually doesn't coincide with that line. It's worse at lower mining shares, but better towards higher mining shares, which is interesting. So it's not like every solution is decreasing uniformly. So there's different solutions that do different, that have different distributions rather. And then uniform tie breaking is just this idea of getting two blocks rather, and then randomly deciding which one to use. And then no defense shows that selfish mining is profitable currently in the Bitcoin system. You'll actually make significantly more than you should. Are there any questions on these graphs? Yes, Darius.
Is no defense like what there is now?
Yeah, no defense is what there is now. And it's actually interesting, the publish or perish paper was published very recently in 2017. And I don't believe they've implemented any solutions to selfish mining in Bitcoin. So it's still an open problem. Did you have a question? Yes.
When I think about the weight here, I think about the Ghost protocol for Ethereum. Is that taken from the same idea, or are they separate concepts?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the Ethereum Ghost, the three heaviest observed symmetry,
Mm-hmm.
is that taken from this concept also, or are those separate ideas?
I don't know the specifics of the Ethereum protocol, but there are differences. I mean, there was probably some similar idea in the sense of just like trying to find a solution to finding the most valid chain, but I don't know that they're founded in the same like specifics. Yeah, we can follow up on that. And the question was about if this is just similar to how Ethereum resolves if a chain is the highest weight or not. Minchi?
I just look at it like, why can the selfish miners still gain value by doing this, even though we implement the profit?
Why can they still make a profit?
Yeah.
So this is just to point out the idea that not only is this not like a perfect solution, as you approach that 50% mark of the hash power, there's always going to be the issue of people being able to make their own chains essentially. So like, it's really difficult to have an ideal solution to this. Like nobody has found one yet. This is just one way to cut down on that profit threshold. And if you look for like miners with less than 25% of the hash power, it's pretty decent. You wouldn't expect them to make like almost anything more than the ideal case where they don't make anything extra. Yeah. So it's just because this solution hasn't totally been solved, and it's not even certain that there is an absolute solution to selfish mining. I believe there's one last slide. It's just a lot of limitations and drawbacks of this implementation. There's points in here that are a little bit opinion-based, so I'll point those out as we get to them. So the main idea of this publish or perish scheme is that it posits that there's a synchronicity. So everybody is working at the same time. And that's an issue because Bitcoin itself is founded on this base assumption that it's an asynchronous network. So that assumption of an upper bound of the time it would take for a block to propagate is an issue, and it doesn't make this totally useless. Max Fang thought so. He's a very reputable source if you don't know who he is. He's the president of BAB. But I do think that this is actually a very interesting and effective solution in the short term because it does resolve a lot of the issues. It's backwards compatible, but it really does come down to opinion and the assumptions that you really value in the Bitcoin ecosystem. Further, when the failsafe parameter is greater than 1, an attacker could kind of use a means of confusing the rest of the miners in the sense that since tau is determined on a local miner's perspective, if you publish a block right before tau runs out from your perspective, what might happen is you've got a lot of confused miners that might count your block in the longest chain rather, and then some that might not count it or count the weight rather. So you can have this discord that might make it easier to abuse the system and just confuse miners in general. It also is an issue because of that, again, the fixed upper bound on when a block is propagating. You could have issues with, say there's like a network partition where it kind of like splits into two and there's people mining on one chain and people mining on another chain and they come back together. They might have a lot of issues in that they don't really know what's valid anymore. Also, during the transition period to this weighted FRP, there might be opportunity to launch double spend attacks, basically abuse the new system as it's going into place. It doesn't really permit forking. It doesn't consider transaction fees in how effective a miner's strategy is, so it might actually be more profitable than we'd think. And it doesn't consider how selfish miners might be able to collude to maybe make this a more profitable scheme, or it really just doesn't consider a lot of different things that are realities in the Bitcoin ecosystem. And so it doesn't actually achieve this incentive compatibility that we want, where people should act according to the protocol. But that said, it's the best solution up to date. And I think that's it for the lecture. So if you have any questions on today's material, please submit them to this Google form. And yeah, otherwise have a great weekend. Oh, and the homework for next week.